Tonight on Nation to Nation, Prime Minister gets called out by a Grand Chief in Quebec, and it has to do with Justin Trudeau supporting Kinder Morgan.
Trudeau has said in the past that his most important relationship was that with the First Nations, and with this, it's proving that was a lie.
And now Trudeau wants money from a BC First Nation to cover Ottawa's costs in a court battle over the pipeline.
You know, in terms of the federal government, they say it's a standard sort of ask when this type of motion is introduced.
In Toronto, an Indigenous woman is trying to get elected.
And it's really important for me to see our legislature reflect the communities that it serves. And I think for a very, very long time, you know, the Indigenous perspective has been very underrepresented.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamarand. Welcome to Nation. The Treaty Alliance Against Tar Sands Expansion is made up of 150 First Nations across North America. The group was formed to fight pipeline projects, and right now, they have their sights set on Kinder Morgan. Serge Simon is Grand Chief of the Kanesatake Mohawk Council. He's also a member of the Alliance. Joining me now is Serge Simon. Welcome to Nation, Grand Chief Simon.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Of course, the Trudeau government is continuing to say this pipeline will get built. Yesterday, the finance minister said they'll cover the costs. He even called it indemnifying the pipeline. What do you make of all that?
Well, it's really disappointing. I think in hindsight, it's also very alarming that the government would go that far to protect an outside interest like Kinder Morgan, you know, a Texas-based corporation. Trudeau has said in the past that his most important relationship was that with the First Nations, and with this, it's proving that was a lie. It's not true. I mean, you know, First Nations are being brushed aside with their concerns and their worry about these potentially dangerous projects coming through our territories. So, yeah, it's disappointing.
You mentioned, of course, First Nations being brushed aside. It seems like it's certainly in the mainstream, it's more about the province versus BC versus Alberta, BC versus Canada. Why do you think First Nations aren't getting their due in this whole issue?
Well, I think it has to do with acknowledgement. If they were to acknowledge that we have this right, or the government has this obligation, I mean, it could be a real game changer when it comes to industry and governments and these projects and First Nations. So I think that's what's at the center of this whole thing. It's that recognition they don't want to give.
Now, of course, there are people out there like Chiam First Nation Chief Ernie Cray who say you have no say in this pipeline. You, of course, have no territory in BC or Alberta, so you should stay out of the argument. What do you say to his criticisms?
It's a shortcut to thinking, that's for sure. But yeah, he can say whatever he wants. It's a debate we'll have to have somewhere down the line, whether I have that right or not. But I know for sure that if I don't want his pipe coming through my territory, it's not coming through. I don't care what he says.
Now, of course, we don't have to remind our viewers about the Oka crisis. Now, there's been some talk about sending in more police or even a military response to get this pipeline built. Do you foresee it getting that bad, that there could be another Oka crisis except in Burnaby?
God, I hope not. Look, I went through that here 28 years ago, and I wouldn't want to see that anywhere in this country. You know, a dialogue that's based on respect and recognition of rights can avoid all that. If you're going to push the industry's concerns over First Nations concerns on our territory, you're going to see a flashpoint somewhere, and I'm really hoping for my friends in BC that it doesn't go that way for them.
What have you heard from some of your friends in BC about what's going on back there?
Well, they are very determined, and rightly so. They should be, because this pipe represents a direct threat to their natural resources. I think the Premier of BC, took the right position. He depends a lot on tourism. The Tsleil-Waututh Nation, which is a good friend of mine, depend on the waterways there for mollusks and fish, and well, you got the salmon spawning and all that. So yeah, it's I'm really concerned for my friends out there.
I'm just going to change gears a little bit here, Grand Chief. Of course, we have a AFN election coming up in July. I suppose what's the number one issue facing the Assembly of First Nations as we go into that election for National Chief?
The number one issue, I think, would be the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Rights, and also the neglect they've actually shown towards another mechanism that I've been telling the National Chief they should be fighting for. Side by side with the UN is the American Declaration on Indigenous Rights. You have two major human rights mechanisms for First Nations, and only one is being used. They really should look at that, because they're really shortchanging us when they're talking about only one declaration.
So you don't think the Liberal government is serious when they say they support Romeo Saganash's Bill C-262?
I've already had this argument with Romeo some time back. The UN Declaration is already based in Canadian law. If you look at past human rights mechanisms that Canada has signed, like the International Rights of the Child, there are mechanisms, there are articles in the UN and the American that deal with the rights of Indigenous children. So that brings the UN and the American Declaration right into Canadian law, and they're refusing to look at that. I really don't get it, but that's something we'll have to touch on later on, I guess.
I would like to ask you, I got to ask you this, who are you leaning towards as far as National Chief goes?
Well, so far I only know of two candidates, and myself, I have differences with the present National Chief, but I think Perry Bellegarde has the energy and the intelligence, and I think he has the heart to continue on. I say give him another chance, put him back up there, and let's get together and fight the good fights.
When you say that, I suppose what's the one quality that you think that he's espoused that you would get behind?
Well, his tenacity, I gotta say, he's a tenacious chief. When he bites down on a particular issue, he really goes for it, and he really has that openness, I think, that a national chief should have for the chiefs here in Canada and individuals and groups. I mean, he's really open, so I like that.
Critics, of course, say he's been too cozy to the federal government. I suppose, what do you say to that?
They've said that about every national chief as far back as I can remember, and it's not going to change. I mean, the national chief is there. He's the conduit between the chiefs of Canada and the government of this country. So, yeah, he has to keep some level of openness. I don't know.
Do you think he's done enough, certainly on this pipeline issue, though?
Well, the national chief has a delicate balance. He can't really advocate for one side or the other, and I'm not looking for him to either. You know, there are those who want the pipelines and those who don't. So the national chief has to be able to bring these two sides together, as he's done in the past. He's brought me on stage, and he brought Chief Boucher from Fort Mackay on stage so that we could have a dialogue with everyone. I mean, that's the type of openness I'm looking for. But, you know, the pipeline issues and that we'll try to resolve amongst ourselves.
Okay, on that note, Grand Chief, I want to thank you again for talking to me.
All right, and thank you for Grand Chief Stuart Phillips. Keep up that fight. Love you.
I'm sure he will.
You bet. Take care.
Thank you.
Anna.
After the break, more on Kinder Morgan and Ottawa's efforts to get a First Nation to pay their court costs. Welcome back to Nation. The Tsleil-Waututh First Nation in BC has been leading the legal charge against the Trans Mountain project. A decision from the Federal Court of Appeal on whether to overturn it is expected in the near future. However, earlier this month, Tsleil-Waututh may have delayed that decision by submitting a new motion based on secret documents uncovered by the National Observer. In response, both Kinder Morgan and the federal government want that First Nation to cover its legal bills during the delay. Joining me now is Mike D'Souza. He's the managing editor of the National Observer. Welcome to Nation.
Thank you, Todd.
Now, I want to make it clear to our audience, Kinder Morgan and the Government of Canada aren't responding to the judicial review itself, but to an extraordinary motion that Tsleil-Waututh Nation made on May 2nd. What was that motion?
Asking the court to reopen the case. As you know, Todd, the hearings in that judicial review wrapped up in last fall, and we were expecting a decision, a ruling by the court, perhaps this month or maybe in June. What they have done is that even though the hearings wrapped up, they want the court to reopen essentially the evidence or the evidentiary the evidence or the file to accept new evidence based on some of the reporting that National Observer has done, some of the documents that we have located or uncovered through access to information, as well as some leaked documents that indicate what was going on behind the scenes before the government actually announced officially that it was approving the project. So it filed that motion on May 2nd. And as you know, there have been a flurry of responses that have come through from both the federal government, from the company, and from a few of the other affected First Nations.
Now, I guess specifically, why does Kinder Morgan and the Government of Canada want legal costs recovered?
Well, they say, in terms of the federal government, they say it's a standard sort of ask when this type of motion is introduced. So that's the official response that they have given. Kinder Morgan goes a bit further in the filing that it made to the court on May 14th, saying that they believe the motion introduced by the Tsleil-Waututh was repetitive or was essentially, in Kinder Morgan's point of view or in their lawyer's point of view, they believe it's very similar or almost identical to the one that they had tried to introduce in June of 2017 in asking for a variety of documents to be released related to the government's decision. So they go as far as saying that in terms of what Kinder Morgan's lawyer said, that they believe the Tsleil-Waututh is they suggest is abusing the process. They believe that the Tsleil-Waututh lawyers have misrepresented what is in the file, and they believe that the files are not relevant to the official decision or the official actions of the federal government. So that is their point of view.
Your article seemed to suggest the consultation process was a bit of a sham because project approval was predetermined. What were the facts that you uncovered?
Well, in terms of the public servants who were directly, there were a group of public servants that were meeting directly on behalf of the Crown to work on the accommodations and consultations with the affected First Nations. Now, those who were working on the file, and we're talking about, maybe somewhere between at least 20 different public servants that were reviewing the file and providing the advice to government, they were given instructions about a month before the project was approved, telling them that their job was to find a legal way for Cabinet to say yes to the project. Now, this is unusual, of course, because at the time the federal government was saying that they hadn't made a decision, that they were still actively consulting First Nations. So certainly it was unusual in terms of the public servants who were given these instructions, to be told, your job isn't to find all options, but your job is to rather focus on one option and find a way to yes. And certainly there were a number of public servants that were concerned after getting those instructions, and they have chosen to come forward and speak to me about it, and they want that story to be told so that the public knows this is what happened behind the scenes.
This morning I asked the finance minister how he can indemnify a project that was still under a bit of a legal cloud, and all he wanted to talk about was the rigorous environmental assessment process that it went through. So what could be the consequences of this latest delay?
Well, Kinder Morgan has already said that they have been harm just by the fact that the motion was introduced, that it could delay, if the court was prepared to announce its decision this month, perhaps, it has been forced to push that back a bit. It seems highly unlikely that a decision would come out before this May 31st deadline. So there's a big cloud of uncertainty hanging over, I think, Todd, over whether the project can go ahead, because the court could still have the option of rejecting the federal government's approval. And the court could ultimately, if it decides to reopen this case and accept new evidence, we're talking about, in Kinder Morgan's words, several months more of deliberations, perhaps review of evidence. There could be cross-examination of affidavits presented. There will be all kinds of different legal maneuvers that would be triggered if it's reopened. But again, we don't know. We don't know what the court will do. Given the fact that this is almost unprecedented for a case that is under judicial review, it's not a standard trial. It is something new. So the Federal Court of Appeal, it would be setting a precedent if it does in fact reopen this case to new evidence. So I don't know what the court is thinking. So we'll see. The lawyers for the Tsleil-Waututh are going to be replying to all the various responses to its motion. We're expecting that in the next day or so. So we'll see. They'll present their final arguments, and then it'll be up to the court to review and make a decision.
Mr. De Souza, I want to thank you again for being on Nation to Nation.
Okay. Thanks very much, Todd.
After the break, we speak to one of the few Indigenous candidates running for election in Ontario. Welcome back. In less than a month, Ontario voters go to the polls. So far, the campaign has been about big spending promises, constant comparisons to Progressive Conservative leader Doug Ford to Donald Trump, but little in the way of discussion about how a new government would best serve Indigenous people. Suze Morrison is one of only a handful of Indigenous candidates in this election. She's running for the NDP in the riding of Toronto Centre. First, here's some video of Morrison driving a Honda Del Sol at an autocross event last summer. Ms. Morrison, welcome to Nation.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, why as an Indigenous person are you running to be elected as a member of the provincial legislature?
Yeah, well, I identify as someone with both mixed settler and Indigenous heritage. And it's really important for me to see our legislature reflect the communities that it serves. And I think for a very, very long time, the Indigenous perspective has been very underrepresented. And we have a number of issues that are really important to communities that we need to do a better job of advocating for. I think at the top of my list, we're looking at cleaning up the clean drinking water in our northern communities, addressing reconciliation, ensuring we have adequate funding for our urban Indigenous communities. There's so much work to be doing, and I'm so excited to be part of it.
You said on social media that more Indigenous people need to be elected to Ontario's legislature, and the Commission seemed to agree and created two northern ridings, one of them where 2/3 of the population is Indigenous. But what more should be done?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of barriers to getting to entering into politics. We see this in a lot of racialized communities, in the Indigenous community, and also for women. And I think that part of the problem is that our young people can't necessarily grow up they can't be what they can't see. And if they don't see themselves reflected in the communities or in different professions, including in government, it's hard for them to imagine themselves existing in those spaces.
What attracted you in particular to the NDP?
Yeah, I think that the NDP is, the most progressive on a number of issues that are really important to me, including addressing poverty, addressing housing, reconciliation. I grew up the daughter of a single mom, and we spent 15 years waiting on the housing wait list for affordable housing here in downtown Toronto. I grew up on that wait list, and I know what it's like to grow up in poverty and to experience precarious housing. And we need those voices at Queen's Park, and we need people that know what it's like to go through those experiences to advocate on behalf of communities.
Do you think Indigenous issues have been getting enough traction in this particular provincial election?
I'd always like to see more of it, of course. But, one of the reasons I'm really excited to be with Andrea Horvath is I've seen how passionately she's spoken about, particularly the importance of fixing the clean drinking water in the north. And she has said unequivocally, the time is done for bickering between different levels of government about whose jurisdiction it is to fix the clean drinking water problem. And we've committed to ensuring that northern communities have access to clean drinking water and then sending the bill to Ottawa where it belongs. And it's exciting to stand with a leader who's so passionate about addressing these important issues for communities.
Of course, Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott, that's her area, and she's promised to end. And just this week, she, in a press release, said how more water advisories have disappeared. So how would a provincial government, I suppose, if it is NDP or Liberal or whatever, work with her to, do a better job of this?
Yeah, I think one of the differences I see in the NDP is a better commitment to working collaboratively with communities and also, respecting the jurisdiction of Indigenous communities. I think that, I personally am committed to recognizing the leadership that communities have taken and recognizing the strengths there. And I think that relationship approach in the NDP is different than we've seen before.
Conservative leader Doug Ford's Indigenous policy appears to be about developing infrastructure to extract minerals in Northern Ontario, creating jobs and wealth there. What's wrong with that?
I think that what's lacking there is the adequate consent and consultation piece. We need to make sure that, particularly when we're looking at resource extraction, that there's proper benefit agreements in place for communities and proper consent to use the land in the way that it's being proposed. A lot of the Conservative policies around land use, resource use, and development are particularly concerning to me. We've heard him talk about paving over the Greenbelt, and what kind of a future are we leaving to our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren when, we're talking about, paving over and developing part of our protected wetlands and our watersheds. I think it's terrifying.
Of course, Doug Ford did retreat from that promise to pave over the greenlands. But I suppose, what else should we be talking about as far as Indigenous issues go in this particular election?
Yeah, I think the other piece that's really exciting for me, coming from, a very densely populated urban center, we know that right here in downtown Toronto, we have one of the largest concentrations of urban Indigenous communities in the province. And working with urban Indigenous communities and in the Friendship Centre movement is really important to me. And in our platform, we have made the most substantial commitments and investments into urban communities, including a very significant contribution to upgrade the capital investments in our Friendship Centres to make sure that folks are getting the programs and services in cities in buildings that aren't falling apart, where their boilers are working, where they have roofs that are in good condition. So we know that there's a significant backlog of capital repairs in the Friendship Centres that we're very eager to support.
Ms. Morrison, good luck in the election, which is just coming up in a matter of weeks. Thank you for speaking to me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That's our show. If you missed any part of it, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Have a great evening.